Welcome to the Commercial Board of Realtors Continuing Education Series. Before we begin with today's presentation, the road to site selection strategies, and their impact, I'd like to introduce your commentaries. Eva Cantarella, a partner at the law firm of Hertz, Schram in Bloomfield Hills, where Eva handles commercial property tax appeals. And yours truly, Tony Jablonski of ALJ Development. That being said, we are honored to have Larry Carlson as a presenter today. I'd like to give you a little background on Larry's history of education and business. Larry Carlson has more than 40 years of broad-based research and management experience in the retail and shopping center industry. For over 25 years of his career, Larry directed large corporate research and real estate strategy teams. First as Vice President of Research and Planning at the Target Corporation, and then as Vice President of Real Estate Market Strategy at Kmart Corporation. For more than 2 decades, Larry has been a lead consultant to more than 20 retail shopping center development businesses in their retail and real estate strategy efforts. He has been an expert witness in a number of court cases involving both current operations and development issues. During his professional career, Larry has been an active member of the Association of American Geographers, and he is past member of the advisory board of Enhancing Departments and Graduate Education in Geography project with the EDGE. For nearly a decade, Larry served as a counselor for the American Geographical Society, known as the AGS. Mr. Carlson is an emeritus member of the steering committee of the Research Advisory Task Force group of the International Council of Shopping Centers, is a past full member of the Urban Land Institute, ULI, and is also a past member of the Advisory Council of the Location Analysis Master's Program at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Larry has been identified as one of the leading applied geographers in the world by the Guznar Center for Geographic Education at Texas State University, San Marcos. He is a recipient of both the 2010 International Council of Shopping Centers Award for Outstanding Service to the Research Community and 2013 Applied Geography Conference Board of Directors Career Service Award, recognizing exemplary and sustained career service to the field of applied geography. Larry earned his bachelor's degree in geography at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, his master's degree in geography at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, has completed the course requirements for the PhD in geography at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, and is a graduate of the Executive Education Program Seminar for Top Management and Retailing at Harvard University Business School. Larry, we're honored to have you here today. Would you like to present your presentation, please?
Could I interrupt just before Larry gets started with his presentation? You have amazing credentials in the geography area, Larry, but I think some of our listeners might not know what geography is as it relates to commercial real estate. So before you go into your presentation, I wondered if you could just explain the concept.
Well, I'm going to do a very short definition of geography and then tell you how it relates to our discipline. If I were to do a description of geography, I would call it a means by which an analysis is done of both physical and human settlement patterns across the Earth's surface, which includes anything that's put together by shopping center developers, whatever is built residentially, and it's all in what I call a spatial context. So the key to geography is understanding relationships between places and things. And I'll just keep it at that. then the question is, how does it relate then to this discipline, commercial development? And the answer is, if you start thinking spatially and you do it properly, you're going to be making much better site decisions, hence much better financial return decisions. And that's kind of the start of it.
Thank you.
Now, what I'd like to do is present an outline for discussion purposes, and Eva and Tony will be asking some questions relative to the outline that's going to be presented here. And what we're going to do is we're going to touch on each of the topics to give you a global picture of what we want to do relative to site selection strategy. And when we end up with this discussion, you'll at least have your toe in the water to understand the importance of doing it correctly so that we can have profitable ventures. I could probably do a total course at a university setting with this outline, but that's not my intent today, obviously. So what we want to do is we want to touch on some of the key factors that make retail, industrial, commercial, office developments work properly. So with that being said, why don't we move to the first slide, or second slide, I guess it would be. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at 6 factors that are involved in looking at market characteristics, which are key to any given. In this case, I'm going to use retail as a proxy since that was my primary emphasis during my career. So if we have these contributors with me, if they want to start asking questions relative to the outline, I'll be happy to answer some of the questions. So Tony, do you have any?
Well, what is the most important aspect beginning with site selection regarding market size, market growth, and so forth?
So touching on that, market size is critical at all levels, whether it be doing strategic market strategies where you have multiple retail units, for example, or if you're doing an individual site, or if you're doing a specific type of retail. And let me give you a couple of quick hints here. If a retailer were to be putting together a very specialized big box strategy, like say IKEA, which has 1 unit in the Detroit area. What's important to IKEA to determine whether or not they're going to have success? Well, what's important to them with that size and what they have in their offerings is to have a market. And if you look at where they have their entities, it's going to have to be a market the size of Detroit or probably greater, because they're going to tap a segment in that market that's going to come to them and buy their goods. And then you can go all the way down to the smallest market, which would be some kind of a convenience store experience, which could include party stores, convenience stores, haircut services. And there you're not going to have a very large market at all, but you're going to have to target the market of where you believe you're going to do the best. So you've got big and then you've got small. Market growth. Market growth is key because if you look at any, I'm going to use retail as a proxy here. If you're going to look at any successful retailer, you're going to have to grow your business. So you're either going to have to grow your business through increased spending, or you're going to have to grow your business through increased population household growth. So you're going to look for markets in the ideal world that are growing in total, at least not decreasing in population, or you're going to look for areas within metropolitan areas that are growing at a fairly rapid rate so that you can continue to grow your market. Then
Larry, how do you determine the market area? How is that determined?
Well, that's a very good question. If you're talking total market strategy, and I'll use Detroit as an example, since most of us are Michigan based here. Detroit's got about 4 million population. If you were to put a strategy together like Target, which I worked on a number of years ago, and we put 27 units in the greater Detroit area, you first of all look at the size of the market, determine how many entities you need to build to serve that market. Then you look at the individual, what we call trade areas, or the areas where you're going to be getting your business from. And you're going to determine for your type of business, how far are people willing to travel, either time distance, or either time or distance. So you're going to establish what we refer to as trade areas. And you're going to show those trade areas based upon the patterns that people use, the roadways that people use to get from one place to another. You're also going to look at geographic barriers, because if you have a river in the middle of your trade area, that's not going to help you much, because people have to get from one side of the river to the other. So you're going to have some boundaries that are going to determine the trade area.
Might highways as well help determine the trade area, the location of major travel arteries?
Absolutely. I'll give you a very good example, because it's the more recently developed area for retail in the metropolitan area of Detroit. And that's Macomb County, M59, Hall Road, where every kind of retail under the sun is located. But it's an area that can be quite easily reached by I-94 in the east, by M53 from the south and from the north, obviously I-94 from the northeast, and then M59 from the west. So yeah, definitely the major arteries are key to the development, particularly of the large retail nodes.
And so
What do
how
you,
would an investor determine whether the market area is already has too much of that investor's type of business or not enough? How is that determined? They hire you for that, Larry?
Yes, they would. Well, we've got a lot of material here, but let me try to use an example of how to determine whether or not something might work. So let's go to the small. If you're on a major artery, where I happen to live, I live along Dixie Highway. Dixie Highway, where I live, US 24, probably has an average daily traffic volume of 50,000 cars plus. And it's a major artery serving actually Telegraph Boulevard all the way up to Flint, if you want to go that far. And along this artery are numerous party shops, convenience store, gas stations, because they feed off the traffic that's coming along Dixie Highway. Also, you've got the hairstylists that are located in clusters along Dixie Highway, because people can get to those locations easily. But the draw is not all that significantly far. You have a couple supermarkets in my vicinity, including a Kroger, which depend upon Dixie Highway as being the primary access to their given location. With that being said, the party shops, the hairstylists, the convenience stores, even though they have access to Dixie Highway, do not have a trade area, what I call trade area. They probably extend more than 2 to 3 miles maximum. And that's roughly where we'd expect maybe 70 to 80% of their trade to come from. The trade area for a Kroger would be a little bit larger, but not usually more than 5 miles distance. Again, where probably 70, 80% of the customers and sales come from. So even though you're located generally in one area, the different types of retail have different draws. And then if you want to look at the larger developments, like say Great Lakes Crossing, that shopping center, because it happens to be a big outlet mall, has quite an extensive trade area where people come on weekends from as far away as Saginaw, far away as they claim, Taubman claims, at least far away as northern Ohio. But that location is totally dependent on freeway I-75 and the access from the region. And its trade area easily would be more than 2 million in size. So you got to start thinking of where your customer is going to be coming from. How big is your trade area, and what's the population that's going to serve you in that trade area?
Okay, so the source of the customers is a key factor in determining the trade areas. I understand it. You get that right?
The type of retail determines the trade area that you will normally have. With Target's trade area on average is between 4 and 5 miles, depending on the actual road configuration and any geographic barriers, and also depending on where the next store is located. And that's where 70% to 80% of Target sales would be generated from. With supermarkets, the trade area would be a little less than that on average. For example, Kroger would have more stores than what Target would have because they have smaller trade areas, and to fill a market area, they're going to need more stores to serve that market area. I happen to have 3 Kroger stores within what I would call a trade area that I might shop from within, and I can choose which store I wish to go to. It only depends on the distance and what I believe about the given store in one of the locations. So Target has only 1 store, which is down by Great Lakes Crossing.
When I was director of Kroger food stores, spent 12 years there. Just to follow up on your situation, Larry, the primary trade area where 70% to 80% of the business came from was within 3 miles. And the secondary trade area was between 3 miles and 5 miles. So I agree with you 100%. And then, which means that in some instances, we would place 2 Kroger stores within 10 miles of each other or less,
right,
depending on the density of the population and any leakage that may come from. Could you touch on leakage within the trade area?
Well, let's move, Tony, let's move, if you don't mind. I'm going to do a couple of quick hits here on this slide, and then let's move to the next slide, and then we can certainly talk about that.
Okay, thank you.
So there's within, again, as I told you earlier, we could do a course on this, but so we talked a little bit about market size. We've talked about market growth. Now, we haven't talked much about demographics, but I will tell you this: we've got to be very cognizant, if we're in a retail business especially, who our primary demographic is. Is it an upscale shopper? Is it a middle income shopper? Is it a lower income shopper? Is it possibly a strategy that's more ethnic in terms of its focus? So you cannot locate, say, I'll give an example. You wouldn't want to put a Nordstrom store, which is much more fashion oriented and more upscale in its offering, in more than 2 or 3 areas of a metropolitan area like Detroit, because you don't have that kind of demographic in at least 50% of the Detroit area. So you have to kind of peg your market and where your type of market is. And we can get in a little bit of that later in our presentation. Let's look at labor force for a minute. Labor force is really interesting because if you look at, particularly in Detroit, where you've had a lot of union employment in the auto industry, you've got patterns of settlement in the Detroit area that are distinctly different, and how the customer looks at a retailer is largely dependent upon what they're familiar with as consumers, and it's interesting, and I don't think it's absurd to use the technical today, but historically we referred to it as white collar, blue collar. However, I'm wearing a shirt that might be more blue collar today than white collar, but what it refers to is more the type of employment. And you might have professionals, business employment versus more service oriented. And there'd be a whole distinction that's different with those demographics. So you want to look at that and understand who your customer is. Labor force, basically, if you're in non-retail, you're going to want to know what your labor force, what the numbers in your labor force might be, because you might have to employ a number of people if you're going to be opening a plant or distribution center or even retail. And I'll leave that for now. Infrastructure is critical, obviously, which includes access off major freeways and so forth. And if you're looking at smaller markets that are more unique, say Ann Arbor, which is part of the greater Detroit area, you obviously have the educational facility there that drives that demographic and also drives what's happening growth-wise. And across Michigan, if you were to have a strategy that was focusing more on students and so forth out of universities, you'd go to the markets where you have a network of colleges, like Kalamazoo with Western Michigan, Ypsilanti with Eastern Michigan, so forth, Central Michigan. Even up in the UP, you'd be interested in Marquette with Northern Michigan, and so forth. So why don't we go to the next slide? No, I think Eva, you had asked the question kind of like, how do you know if a market is right? So why don't we talk about that for a minute? And I'll use supermarket data to try to drive home the point here. So according to the most recent data published by the Department of Commerce, the per household expenditures per week in food at home, and I'll just call that grocery, is about $140 per household, or roughly $600 per month. Per person is about $90 per week and about $375 per month. So let's just take those numbers for a moment and try to find out if say a store like Kroger would locate, since you've got a background in that, Tony. So let's say that Kroger says we want to build a 50,000 square foot supermarket. In today's world, to make any money in a supermarket, you're going to have to do somewhere around $10 a square foot per week in sales. So that means you're going to have to generate $500,000 in sales. Now, we know that any one retailer is not going to get 100% on the market. And in all likelihood, Kroger might attract a quarter of that business, 25% of that business. So for them now to operate a store that's going to be successful at $500,000 a week, they're going to have to be in a trade area that has at least $2 million expenditures for in-home, at-home food, $2 million. So that equates to, you need a number of households, 15,000 households to make that store work. In smaller markets, and I'll use this as an example, let's say you go to Gaylord or some smaller market like that. You probably can have a profitable store with a little less per square foot, maybe $8 a square foot, because the economics of just the development are less in cost. So let's say you need to do $300,000 or $400,000 in food and grocery sales. Well, you might be able to get half the market because there might be only 2 big competitors in that market. But you still are going to have a store that would need about, I did some math here, be about maybe 2,500 households up to 5,000 households. So, and you'd probably build a store that's more like 35,000, maybe 40,000 square feet. So you match the size of the store, you match what your expectations are at the size of the trade area. So the bottom line is, if you overbuild and you don't have a big enough trade area, you're going to struggle with sales, hence profits. So market size is really critical.
And Larry, I would assume having excellent data for these different things you talked about, household income, number of households, whether they're at the upper or lower end of the income stream, getting that data, I would assume would require someone to hire an expert. Is that right? Generally speaking?
Well, when we get near the end of my presentation here, I'll talk a little bit about where you can get the resource information. And I'll give a few hints of where you might go where it's not quite as costly, but there are vendors, we call them vendors. They put all this information together and they sell it to either consultants who will do work for you, or they'll sell it to the company that's doing their own research. And I'm not sure, Tony, if Kroger does their own in-house anymore, but a lot of companies use outside resources to do their research. But why don't we talk about near the end, Eva?
I had to mute myself. Somebody went by with a lawnmower here, so sorry about that.
So now here's the point. You need a certain size of dollars just to make something work, which hence translates into so many households, hence is so much of a population base. So the bottom line is, if you have a supermarket generally, that'd be a more typical supermarket, you're going to need between 35,000, 50,000 people in a trade area to make it work. And in smaller markets, you might still be able to make it work because you might be one of 2 competitors. And if you can get half the market, you can probably still make it. But when you're in a market like, well, Detroit's not as good an example because it's not as competitive a market as, say, if I were to go to Dallas or Houston, who have, the top 4 major supermarket chains plus regional chains. So all these supermarkets are going after the same business. So you're not going to get 25% of a market in any given trade area because you're going to be competing against 3 other or 4 other strong retailers. So you may need more people in that trade area than you would in Detroit, okay? Now, you've got a kind of a hybrid, of course. I should mention it at least, but they're really successful because of their food operation, and that's Meijer. But Meijer, with so much square footage in any of their units, which is well over 100,000 square feet, they've got a few stores that are less than that, but with that kind of square footage, they're going to need a larger trade area distance-wise for people to come and shop, and they're going to need more available dollars, hence more people. And then, of course, they'll generate additional sales because they got the general merchandise side of the store, which does generate. And when we were doing some work back in the day when I was with Kmart in our supercenters, we've got about a 30% add-on in business and in the food area just because of the general merchandise component, because people are coming there to shop general merchandise and then they're coming over to the food side. Now, the question that's been posed to me over the last number of years is what's going to happen with e-commerce and how is that going to impact brick and mortar? I'm just following down here in the outline. Well, the most recent data suggests that 20.8% of total retail sales in the United States, 20.8%, were online sales. That number is estimated to increase to 22% by the end of this year. So slightly less than a quarter of total retail sales are e-commerce. So what does that mean? Well, it means that e-commerce is gradually increasing their share. It was as low as 15% in 2019. But the issue is going to be, where does it stop? And as a professional in the business, I think we're getting to the point where things are going to settle out, and we're going to end up maybe maxing no more than 25% of total retail sales in e-commerce. And there are a number of reasons for it. We found with COVID that people went online like crazy because obviously they're buying goods that couldn't get into retail stores. But now that retail stores are open again, the brick and mortar sales have been increasing at a greater rate than e-commerce, which is a rebound effect. So it's going to, in a sense, in my opinion, stabilize. So I'm going to just make one comment. E-commerce is going to be a big part of our retail sales equation for a long time, but brick and mortar is not going to go away. Okay, so the next question is, if you're looking at new retail developments, where is it most attractive for a new store or retail development? And if I were to bring a new strategy into Detroit, and when I say Detroit, metropolitan area, let's use a very simple one, which is extremely successful, and that's Chick-fil-A, which has just entered the metropolitan area. And my guess is once they're done with their expansion, they're going to be in many, many locations. But the key for somebody like Chick-fil-A is, where would you put your first unit, your second unit, your 10th unit? Chances are you're going to go where all the retail is, where you have the most activity. And guess what? Chick-fil-A has opened up last year a store on M59 in Macomb County, Hall Road. Then the question is, do you have any advantage if you cluster? In other words, do you want to go where you have competing entities, or do you want to be at a distance from competing entities? Well, what's interesting is most retailers, if you look at the landscape, and I went through all my knowledge of what I've known about Minnesota, where I lived for a long time, in Michigan, where I've lived for a long time. And the bottom line is, many, many types of retail or services tend to cluster for various reasons. You have banks tend to cluster. You've got 6 major banks in the metropolitan area, and if you were to look at the locations of all those banks, chances are 80% of them would be in some kind of a cluster where they're all within 2 miles of each other. Why is that? It's because they're where the business is. They're where either retail business is, where the population is. And so they're going to want to cluster where they can get the customer to come to them. Kind of the most interesting one, what I call clustering, is when Home Depot came out with their strategy, and then Lowe's built their first big store. What did Lowe's do? Well, Lowe's matched where Home Depot was. Why? Because they felt they could compete better with them if they're in the same neighborhood, because people, there'll be cross shopping. And so you see Home Depot and Lowe's with like a 75% overlap in almost every market in the United States. Drugstores, you have CVS and Walgreens that tend to locate near each other.
Larry, does that sometimes backfire on the retailer that's trying to cluster? I mean, you just end up with too many and they can't all stay.
Well, that's a very good question. It happens most within the fast food industry because everybody follows the lead of McDonald's, and they all locate where McDonald's is, where the Burger King or Wendy's or whatever, Arby's. And the question is the market big enough to support all of them? And if I use my experience with what I see here near where I live, which is near Dixie Highway, there are only like four of the fast food businesses that are really that's successful? Because the market's not big enough to support more than that. So it's a very good question. If the market's not big enough, clustering is going to hurt the weakest, and the weakest will die, and that's what's going to happen. But it's a very good question.
I see this all the time where I live, just a couple miles away, there's a McDonald's. It's got cars there 24/7. Right across the street on the other side of the street, there's a Burger King.
Yeah.
Very little traffic there. For whatever reason, and I'm surprised it's still in business.
Yeah, but that definitely, and by the way, when I was talking about major clustering, and what's interesting to me, this is what's really interesting. I've been all over the country, and I was just down in the Dallas area, and the clustering there in the growth areas is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, everybody goes to these new growth areas, and they are generally successful because the markets are growing. They're just coming in. They haven't met their peak, and everybody seems to be sharing in success. However, over time, it's going to shake out, and you're going to end up with a better operator still there. But here in the Detroit area, except for Auburn Hills, Novi, those are the three. Auburn Hills, Novi, and Hall Road are the three major retail concentrations here in the metro area. And I think you'll find all the retailers we talked about in those clusters. Auburn Hills probably number 3, Novi number 2, and Hall Road number 1. After that, you'll find some clustering, but it can't be of the magnitude of what you find on Hall Road because the market's not big enough. So why don't we move on? So now we get the competitive factors. Eva, you kind of hinted at this. So the first thing, if I were to locate a new strategy in the market, is who would I be competing with? And if I were a Starbucks type entity, I better have a pretty good product with a pretty dense trade area to take on a behemoth like Starbucks, because they control the market. They have probably 70% of the come to location coffee sales in the market, their product. So you have to know who's there, who you're going to be competing with. In the case of department stores, it used to be that you'd want to be at least equal, if not equal, to whomever the local department store companies were. So, you had Hudson's here, but they were so dominant. None of the other department stores really were that successful. You had in the day when we called them mass merchants, when we first started looking at them, you had Sears, Wards, and Pennies, and knowing fully well that Wards is gone, Pennies is teetering, and Sears is gone. If I were doing work for Pennies back in the day when they were growing, I'd certainly want to know where the Sears was. And then I'd want to be probably with Sears because, again, we're sharing business that's coming to a common location. But, you want to find out who's in the market, who you're going to be competing with. If you were in the supermarket business, and Detroit, Michigan in total is really it's not a classic, highly competitive supermarket, a market for supermarkets. It's you've got two major retail entities, Meijer and Kroger. And then you have a lot of your specialty or small regional department stores. But if you were to go to Dallas, Houston, Nashville, Charlotte, even California markets, you've got a lot of major national competitors that you can be coming up against. So you're gonna pay much more attention to the competitive market than you really need to here. Here you just know, you need to know where the best place would be to build your business based upon the size of the market. If it's growing, you put a store down there. It's not as difficult here. So that's how many like competitors. Here in Michigan, it's not that competitive. Will there be a synergy with the retailers? That's really important. If you have an upscale customer, and even if it's a haircutting business, you're going to want to be in a center where you have a whole market, or Trader Joe's, or some entity like that that's driving the customer to that location that you can share in some of the business. If we can move on. A lot of this is kind of fast, but we're doing an overview, give you some idea of how to think. Okay, so we've touched a little bit on it. And Eva, you asked some questions about the size of the market. The real key in understanding the potential for a market is understanding what your trade area draw is going to be. And I'm going to give you an example of where it was almost absurd when I heard a presentation from a large consulting firm, which I will not indicate who it was, presenting a strategy for a market that when I got through listening to the strategy, I just couldn't believe it. It was for a major retail company, and that company had a couple of large stores in the Pittsburgh market. And if any of you know Pittsburgh, it's slice it and dice it, and valleys and ridges, and I mean, it's difficult to get around the Pittsburgh area. And you have to have bridges across the rivers, or you can't go from one side to the other. So when the strategy was presented, I happened to be in that presentation. They showed trade areas for all these new retail locations that were all rings. They were concentric rings. And half the trade area would be on the other side of the river, but you couldn't get across the river. And then they presented this as if there were 150,000 people in this 5-mile radius. The only problem is 75,000 on one side of the river, 75,000 on the other. So, it's nice to know radiuses, but you better understand what the limits of those radiuses are.
I think that's a really great point, Larry, because I do property tax appeals. I see a lot of appraisals, and the vast majority, and this might be okay for most appraisals, but they are defining the primary trade area and the secondary trade areas by rings that are either, within a mile of the property, or 3 miles, or 5 miles, or sometimes more. But I think that's an excellent point, that you have to look at the natural geographic and, highway type boundaries as well.
And then you have what I call the cultural boundaries. I call it cultural because it's perception. Most of it's perception. So let's use a couple of examples. If you were in the Dearborn area and you had a strategy that you thought you could attract somebody from downriver, you might have a more difficult time to attract a customer north of 94, because the customer living south of 94 has its own retail, and they're not as likely to go north of 94. If you are in the city of Detroit and you've got and you want to, if you're looking at 8 Mile Road, which is a kind of a natural barrier, actually, it's very difficult to get people moving to either side of that artery. And so it becomes kind of a barrier. So if you were to do a radius of something that included both sides of 8 Mile, I would argue it's probably not legit. If you take I-96, which goes across northern, part of Macomb County, Oakland County, I-96 is kind of a barrier. People that live north of I-96 are not likely to go shopping south of I-96. So when you do radii, you've got to be somewhat careful. Some of it's related to demographics, some of it's related to just access, some of it's related to where your retail locations are that are strong. And if you include radii that goes across these, what I call the barriers, the cultural barriers, you're probably misrepresenting the customer for for that property. And by the way, Eva, that's a very good point, because that does establish value of locations for sure, or less value.
And are you going to cover this last point on your slide about transient dollars?
Well, transient dollars, okay. Well, transient dollars, okay, transient dollars are many things. So Flying J, Pilot, any of the big Loves, all these big convenience stores are obviously their strength is transient dollars. It's dollars coming through a location because they're tied to major arteries and major freeways. That's one type of transient dollars. Another type of transient dollars is obviously tourist dollars. So if you get to Florida, and I know Tony's familiar with Southwest Florida, I've done a number of studies in the Fort Myers area. And one of the key elements of determining whether or not something's going to work in that Southwest Florida area, it's true across Florida generally, is what is going to be your tourist volume, of which there are two parts. One is transient. People come in for a day, a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, and leave. Then you have the snowbirds who are there for 4 to 6 months. And so then you have your base population, which is there year round, but the base population probably will only generate 40% of the sales potential for any given location. The other 60% is going to be with transient dollars. So you have to look at what's the orientation. Northern Michigan would be, Traverse City would be a very good example. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would guess that at least a third of the sales done anywhere, maybe 50%, up to 50% in restaurants, whatever, are transient dollars. They're people coming through, staying there for vacations and so forth, and are there for part of the summer. And that determines, so if you did a trade area for Traverse City, let's say the trade area is 100,000 people. Well, you got to add another list, technically like 50,000 equivalents people, because that's going to be the size of your market. So transient dollars in many locations is very critical.
Are you including temporary situations? Like I see a lot of vacant retail space, but come a month before Halloween, all of a sudden all this retail space has got Halloween sitting in it, or later at Christmas time, they've got some big Christmas thing going on. I don't know if you're including that in transient dollars. That's considered something else, temporary dollars.
Well, that's an interesting one. That to me, I call it, to me, I see that it's a leasing challenge.
Yeah.
Because you're going to lease a space, like for the Halloween stuff, for maybe 3 months of the year. I mean, technically, they're going to do business 3 months of the year. Tony, you've worked with fireworks people, and a lot of those locations are going to have a lot of transient dollars, but only for a very small part of the year. And I'm not sure how they do it in terms of analysis, but they're only factoring in maybe 3 months of business. Is that fair to say, Tony?
Right. They're factoring in the draw, the trade area, demographics, all the items that you touched on, and primarily the traffic. What is the motorized traffic and the demographic population, like in Washtenaw County, of Gulfside Road and Washtenaw Avenue. There's a former Farmer Jack there that's now got a Crunch Fitness, and they don't care about who's in the shopping center. All they care about is the location, because it's at the corner with 30,000 car population. It has the exposure. It was zoned properly, all those factors, and the rent was reasonable too. So yes, you're right. It becomes a leasing situation. I like to segue on to the natural barriers. You were talking about rivers, lakes, etc., and the expressway. In doing business in Southwest Florida with CBS for 4 years, I was in CVS wanted to locate on the going home side of the expressway. You take I-75, the going home side, the town side was everything to the west of I-75. And to the east of 75, there wasn't that much growth at that time. So that's an important factor too. And they want a 30,000 car population with at least 25,000 population. So yes, everything that, and the cluster effect was definitely with Walmart. Everybody's wanted, you remember the old days where everybody wanted a corner location and all you saw is 4 gas stations on the corner?
Yeah.
And then it went to drugstores, then it went to banks and fast food. So all of those items that you touched on, very appropriate. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we could talk, by the way, I'm going to back up for just a second. Competing markets, you know, I'll give you an example. Okay, we've been talking generally about more urban. Detroit is an example, Detroit Metro. But let's talk about some smaller markets in Michigan. And some of you who will be looking at this may know the market, may not. When you drive up I-75, you go by West Branch. West Branch has a small outlet center, which is hanging on, and a Walmart. And there's been interest on the part of a major retailer to put a store there. So the question is, if they did that, what would be the competing markets that they would have to contend with? In other words, are they going to be the stronger of these markets, or are they going to lose business to these other markets? So you look at where you have all these other markets that are near, but they're about the same size as West Branch, but they're further afield. Locationally, there's Tawas City, Roscommon, Houghton Lake, and Standish. Those are all competing towns. The question, and it was posed to me because I was involved in a situation there in West Branch. What is it that makes West Branch the winner? And the answer is the I-75 corridor, okay? So you have to look at where your competing markets are that are your size if you're in more rural areas, because you have to determine whether or not you can get people to come from other counties that are surrounding your say a particular development, or you're going to lose the volume to them. Now, Walmart had a very interesting approach when they grew their business. Walmart basically said, we're going to go in essentially every county seat in the United States of America, particularly everything west of the Mississippi, and we're going to locate a Walmart in every one of these cities. If the county were big enough population, I think they assumed somewhere around 30,000, 20,000 people, and they thought we can drop a Walmart in there. But they went county seat. And the reason is they could serve the whole county, and then they go to the county next to them and go to the county seat. And if you look at their location strategy today, I'd say that 80% of their stores that are not urban are in county seats. Interesting.
Good to know.
Let's move on. Oh, now this one's really interesting. Tony, you brought this up, you know. Again, I kind of focused on Hall Road because, I mean, everybody and their brothers on Hall Road. Okay, I mean, it's like if you want to find most, whether it be a sit-down restaurant, fast food restaurant, you name it, everybody's up there. So the latecomers had to find locations. Where do we locate? Well, I mean, the best, of course, would be on Hall Road, visibility, access to Hall Road, in front of some existing retail that generates a lot of business. But guess what? All those available sites are gone. So now what do? You go down south of Hall Road, north of Hall Road. How far do you go before you lose the mystique of the traffic? And the answer is it slides pretty quickly because visibility is key. Number 2, access. Tony, you touched on this. access is key. First of all, no shopper, they always claim it's the woman shopper doesn't like to make left turns, but bottom line is most shoppers do not like to make left turns to go into retail. They prefer to go a right turn. It's much easier. And then they want a way to get out of that location where they're not against a lot of traffic. So you want to have something far enough from the intersection where you aren't having problems with stop traffic. You want to make sure that most people come in with a right turn. You want to make sure that you have the visibility. And you want to make sure you have signage so people see you when they come by. So you have to have all those factors together, but the commonality, to me, the two key elements for any good retail site are visibility and access. Those are the two key elements. If you don't have visibility, people don't even know you're there. If you have poor access, I mean, when I used to do work across the country, we'd go by places where we'd call these sites hotel sites. And the reason we call them hotel sites, and Marriott has been kind of an interesting expander of properties. Marriott doesn't always have their properties right at major intersections. They're near the intersection, but you have to drive a little ways to get to them. But they're a destination, so people will find them, and they're tied to a given location, so they can technically be. They don't have to be right on top of an interchange. They could be maybe 500 yards off the interchange and still do quite well, thank you. Whereas a retailer may not do quite well, thank you. So we used to always call those hotel sites. And I remember many times we'd have the real estate agents for us, brokers, they would be driving us around these markets. I remember we had one in Kansas City that showed us, I think, 6 hotel sites. And we said, no, we aren't interested because it's not going to work for Target. How do you get to the store, you know? And he says, wow, we could put a nice hotel there with you. Well, it doesn't make any difference. So we call them hotel sites. So the two key issues to me are visibility and access for any, I'd say 90% of retailers.
And Larry, I would totally agree with you that on retail, but when you're talking about hotels, there's people like me who map the hotel ahead of time. It's too close to the freeway. I'm not going to stay there because I'm a light sleeper and I don't want the noise. So getting away from that intersection makes a lot of sense for a hotel. And whereas a big shopping center, they might want to be closer to the intersection. So
that's a very good point. And by the way, I am 100% in agreement with what you just said. I hate being on freeway sides. I hate the noise. I just came from a hotel in South Lake, which is northwest of the DFW airport, north of Fort Worth, a beautiful development there. And I actually picked the side of the hotel that was the farthest from the freeway because I didn't want the noise because they're only a block away. And if you were at a higher level, you'd hear the noise all night long.
But like you said, it's not retail. It's hospitality. So different considerations there, I guess, a little bit in that sense.
So then I want to talk a little bit about co-tenancy, if I may. I mean, most of the time when you talk co-tenancy, you talk about a shopping center that's a regional shopping center or a large, say, big box type shopping center. Adjacencies are very important. Co-tenancy is very important because you want the kind of retailer that matches your demographic, if you will. And so I just went through a look, and this is going to be a killer for you guys because this is eye-opening to me. Okay, so the first thing I did when I looked at Hall Road is I wanted to determine where are all the big boxes, the real big boxes. Okay, well, you have Sam's Club, Target, Costco, Meijer, Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart Supercenter, Kohl's. They're all up there. You want to be near one of those. If it's your kind of customer, I would say go near one of those. Okay. I wouldn't necessarily go by Home Depot or Lowe's because they don't generate as frequent a business. But on the other hand, I'd love to be by Target or Costco for sure, right? Because That's very important. Then I looked at all the specialty, what I call the big box specialists, like Jared, Dunham Sports, Bed Bath and Beyond, Men's Warehouse, Marshalls, Home Goods, Barnes and Noble, Best Buy, Dick's Sporting Goods. Okay, would you want to be in there are little shopping center developments that are all along Hall Road? Would you want to be in one of those developments? Probably, if you match the demographics of the customer. And I'm going to come back to one that's just come into that area and speculate a little bit about why it's there and what makes sense. And then you have Office Depot. Then you have the furniture stores, Value City. You have all these bargain barn. You want to be by all these bargain barn. Okay, maybe not, maybe. Gardner White, Joanne, Sleep Number, Michael's. And then you have the tire places, Bell Tire, Discount Tire. It's fascinating, all the retailers. So, you know, if you've got a strategy you think matches the customer of those stores, you might want to try to locate near them and find a place. Now, the most recent addition up there is one of my favorite stores because I've traveled across the country and shopped them, Total Wine and More. And no, I'm not on their payroll, but they have probably the best wine collection in the greater Detroit area. They have 3 locations. Now, this is an interesting one. For those of you out there that are doing strategy for companies coming into Detroit, the first question I'd pose to you, if I were a consultant, would be, where do you believe we want to locate these stores? What is their customer base? How big of an area do they need to draw from? What should they really be by to get the co-tenancy they want? Those are very, very key issues. And then how many stores do you think you're going to need? Because that, you have to determine what your draw is, what your trade area is. So Total Wine located in 3 locations: Ann Arbor on Ann Arbor Saline Road, Novi, 8 Mile and 275. And guess what? Hall and Shaner up in Macomb County. So the question is, were those good locations? Or are they good locations? My answer is, yes, they are. The access to the Total Wine in an 8 Mile 275 is atrocious. It's very, very difficult. But if you want to get there, you're gonna end up in their parking lot. But generally speaking, that's not a bad start for that company in terms of whomever did their strategy. But you got to think a little bit about that before you plop a new store down if you're coming into a market. So co-tenancy is key, and geographically it makes a lot of sense as to where you end up. Okay.
Okay. Now, one other thing. Am I on? Okay. Now, here's where the expert comes in for the geography, and that is you have those 3 stores. Then after they're open and running for a period of time, then you would draw your trying to find out get the expert to find out where the trade areas are and where the gaps are, where the voids are in the marketplace, and then put in another location with similar, like maybe the analog model or the gravity model.
Yeah.
And that's where the geography or expert comes into play, and that would be you.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. But the most important, the 2 most important market items that I would claim would drive any strategy would be population and spending potential. Population in terms of density, how many people are you going to serve? And those are your two key indicators of where you want to be. And so if you were to come in to this market, and let's say Walgreens had never been here before, where would Walgreens want to locate, and how many stores? Probably put 100 stores in the metro area because they have smaller trade areas, right? Mm-hmm. By the way, I might make a one point. 2 of the most fascinating strategies that have always done it right, in my opinion. I mean, there are always a few exceptions, but have always done it right. and they've been willing to pay the freight for the locations, are Walgreens and McDonald's. Those companies do not seem to care so much. I mean, they care about costs of real estate, obviously, but they'd rather pay the premium because they know they're going to be in those locations for a long time. And they have 8 locations, 8+ locations in general. And so, and they do it right. You know, Walgreens has done it right for 50 years where they put new stores. Just an aside of 2 companies. And with McDonald's, you know, like I said earlier in this presentation, McDonald's is always followed by everyone else because everyone else thought McDonald's must have done homework, so we might as well follow it. Why don't we move quickly? So that was all retail. Now I'll just do kind of a broad brush here because I'm not going to claim non-retail experience, although I've had some. I've done a lot of bank work. I haven't talked much about banking. That's another entity, follows a lot of the same factors that we talked about, but we can talk about that another day. So if you were to look at locating other non-retail type enterprises, so let me use a couple examples, and we don't know what's going to happen. But you know, we've got. I made a note here. We have 4 locations that I've noted. 3 locations where we've had retail, and whatever is going to replace the retail is not going to end up being retail. It might be small retail, but it's not going to be what it used to be. And number 1 is Summit Place in Waterford, right next to Pontiac on Telegraph. That whole property's been torn down, site's been cleaned, and Waterford is looking at maybe putting light industrial, distribution, office, and so forth, because whomever was the consultant that helped them determined that it was not the best retail location, and that's probably correct. Another one is Northland Mall. Northland Mall, which was where you have the biggest suburban department store in the country with Hudson's, with over 600,000 square feet of space. Again, that's being developed into more mixed use, some industrial. And then you have Eastland, which from what, and I've gone there and not too long ago. That's going to actually be one big distribution center, and they're going to go again non-retail. So does that mean that all retail that goes under is going to end up non-retail? Probably yes, but not always. But you got to start thinking of other uses. Now, in some better locations where you've got weak retail that never did well, it might be best to do a mixed use development where you have apartments, some office, condos, if you've got enough acreage, and rethink what you're going to be doing so it's not all retail. But to do that, you have to know where you're going to get, where your labor force is, especially if you're in a market like Traverse City or Kalamazoo or Battle Creek or Mount Pleasant. You're going to have a labor market where you're going to have people that, if you're going after the labor market, it's going to be way beyond the city. I call that the labor shed. Obviously, available of educated trained workforce is very critical, depending on the type of use. Regional infrastructure is critical because you want to have access that's much more than just local. And then you want to have access to other markets. Mm-hmm. So I just had a chance to talk with somebody who was doing some development in the Toledo market, and he told me that 60% of the population within I think he used 750-mile radius. 50% of the population in the United States is within 750-mile radius of Toledo. So if you were looking at distribution, that would be a good, metro to put distribution centers. Now he was kind of promoting it, but it makes sense. They're really not that poorly located relative to most of the eastern part of the United States. Then let's move on to the next slide. So this one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Most of you that are in development that are going to be listening to this probably understand some of the financial incentives a lot better than I do. But in most cases, to do some of the rehab of existing retail that's gone under is going to require some kind of a financial incentive with the local authorities, whatever they are. And in Michigan, you've got the Michigan Economic Development Corporation that's been involved. You've got in the city of Detroit for the downtown development, former Hudson site. You've got city of Detroit involved with incentives. With Waterford, you've got tax incentives. And in my opinion, if you've had a problem with the site and if you really want to get it off the ground and make it more successful, there's going to have to be some kind of need for an incentive of some type. Not where you incentivize a bad project, because then everybody loses.
Mhm.
So let's go to the very last slide. And then Eva, I was going to tag on a question that you posed earlier about data. So
Can I just
Yeah.
say that kind of the global question that I have here, because you've gone through a lot of analysis, all these different factors to look at. And I don't know if you can speak to this before you finally wind up your presentation, but how does one know when enough research has been done to make a decision one way or the other? There's all this data out there. How do you rein it in? How do you decide? Or do you just hire you? I think somebody, if it's retail, they're going to feel very comfortable just having you do all of that for them. But I don't know if you have any other pointers on that.
well, I've been in situations, not a lot, but when I was in consulting on my own, where I've had projects that have been proposed where both the government entity and the developer entity had their own independent consultants. And my only comment, if anybody here is in a government entity where you're looking at subsidies, I would argue you should have a bona fide look from an expert, have an expert opinion, if you will, on whether or not it's going to work. If I were a developer, I would want somebody that, in all honesty, to tell me if it's worth it or not. But I'm going to make one comment, which someday I told a number of the people that I know in the business, I'd love to get up and talk about this, because what's bothered me in the business for at least the last 20, 25 years, especially with shopping center development people who feel they can build anything, anywhere, at any time, and as big as they want. They'll find a consultant that they'll pay to do a study, which will tell them that it's going to work. And then the consultant will take the money and then do another study. And nobody really catches up to them for 10 years because nobody knows what really is going to happen with the projects. And they're happy, as I used to call it, as a pig in slop, because they got paid for it. And it bothers me because to me, there's an ethics issue here. If you really don't believe something's going to work, why tell your client that it's going to work? Well, you're going to tell your client it's going to work because the client wants you to tell them it's going to work. And it's become a problem. A lot of the projects that we see that have died here in the Detroit area were due to faulty research. It's just the way it is. And we could get, that's for another day. But the answer is, yeah, you should use somebody with some expertise who knows what they're talking about and look at who they worked for. And see what the success rate has been on projects. And if it looks good, then probably they're going to be a value. But it used to be, today we've got whole different types of retail compared to say 30 years ago when regional shopping centers were just going gangbusters. And take a look at all the retail shopping centers, the big ones that have never made it. You know, it's just, in my opinion, poor research. But again, that's for another day.
Larry,
Yeah.
Larry, a couple weeks ago, you and I were talking about Dayton Hudson's initial entry into the marketplace and how you had worked with Mr. Hudson and so forth.
Right.
Could you touch on Westland?
Well, you know, here's what's interesting. in fact, I'm reading I'm reading a book now. I just got it. I'll meet you at the clock tower or something in the mall. So it's a woman who's she's writing about all these the history of all this development. So Hudson's, it's really interesting. In fact, it's in this book. I was reading it on the airplane coming back yesterday. You know, the Weber family, who was running Hudson's at the time, because the Weber, she was the daughter of Joe Hudson Sr., and then she married into the Weber family, and there was no son to run the business. So the Weber family was running the business. And so when the proposal was to do Northland, I can't remember the name of the architect right now, it's not important, was to build something which ended up being a Northland, where it's like a whole new retail entity, and it's going to serve all the growing population north of 8 Mile Road, west of what's now 275. And so it was built, and everything seemed to work well because that's only 2 stores in a metro area of about 3.5 million people. And so both stores did very well. They were, both of them are doing easily over $100 million. And then Westland came along, or there was a proposal to do a store on the west side. Well, what the Weber family said was, yeah, we can do a store out on the west side of the market, but put it as far away as you can from downtown because we don't want to cannibalize the sales out of downtown. And I don't know the history of who bought the site and why they even put it where they built it. But, you know, it's a regional center that's kind of buried with no regional access, right? I mean, it's the craziest mall because you really can't get to it unless you know the local streets. There is no, I mean, if the city of Westland had just built the connector road to I-275 and had an interchange, it might have helped a lot, right? But never happened. But they didn't care because they built the store. They figured we're going to serve that side of the market. And it's as far away from downtown as we can have it. And lo and behold, Westland ended up being a decent store, never really, you know, huge volume, but not a bad store because there's nobody else out there. But it's a buried regional location. And look at the mall today. I mean, it's hurting, you know. That's kind of.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's talk for a moment about, you were asking about data, Eva, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert, a most recent expert on who's out there now as vendors selling it, data, but I can give you some examples of people that are providing data and mapping. The one that you're going to see the most of, for those of you who are taking this course, Esri, E-S-R-I, has a program called ARC GIS Pro, A-R-C, and then GIS Pro, where they can provide both demographic information and mapping capabilities for any place in the United States and even foreign countries, because they're a big entity. The problem with them, unless you're a big organization is a very high cost. Then there's another firm called Maptitude, MAPTITUDEGIS, Maptitude, who are a lower cost and can probably provide data and mapping for individual projects on a fee, or I was going to say a fee basis, basically the cost of doing it for a given location, which would be much lower cost than what Esri would be. And then there's another firm called Map Info, MAP, capital INFO. They have a product called Map Info Professional. They really compete against Esri, and they are used by a number of banks, probably because it got in the banking industry, and then you know how that works. You end up with one bank uses it, and then another bank uses it. They do modeling as well. They do sales forecasting. I can't speak to them particularly, except those who have used either Esri or Map Info. I believe Map Info is a little easier to use. Esri is used by many planning firms. It's like standard, the ArcGIS.
Appraisers cite Esri very often in their reports
Yeah,
on big projects.
right, yeah. But if you do big projects in your big organization, you know, I'd say use it because they can give you really good information, do very good mapping and so forth. It's just that you better have a pretty big overhead to be able to cover the costs, that's all.
Right.
But they're very good at what they do, there's no question. Now, as far as demographic mapping software, if any of you out there want to do it, when I was in business, I used a firm called Scan US, SCAN US, where you could basically buy, well, when I was at Kmart with you, Tony, that we used them because everyone we could buy one for each. Basically they charge us per computer and so forth, and it was very easy to use, very inexpensive, had very good data. But I think they're at a point where it's going to be a question if they're going to continue with all the other big guys out there competing. And then Maptitude, again, they do a nice job. You can get some good mapping software. Site USA, they provide the capability to do mapping online. And then there's a firm that's been in business now for roughly 15 years or so out of Texas called, originally it was called PopStats, POPSTATS. It is what has been purchased by Synergos, which is SYNERGOS. And I have not used them, although I know some of the principles, and they are probably one of the better estimators of population and demographic change in the US. So those are some that could offer some of you out there who need the service. And you have to determine, what the freight will be that'll match your capabilities. And it changes all the time. The one thing that I miss is going to the ICSC convention, because one of the things I always used to do, the shopping center convention, is visit all the vendors, because I wanted to know what they offered. They could show me what their product was. And it was a way for me to basically shop the market.
Well, those are all great suggestions. Thank you.
So that's kind of it for today, folks. I think, where do we go, about an hour and 15 minutes, something like that? A lot of material.
We've definitely given everybody a good bang for their buck with all of this information. It's,
well, this could be a book, but I tried to cover more, looking from 10,000 feet up in the air, right? Because at least it kind of gives you a sense of direction here.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry. We appreciate it. And I'm sure all of our commercial brokers out there and guests appreciate it as well.
Well, if they can gain a little bit of knowledge out of this and help them make better decisions, that's what it's all about.
Absolutely.
Okay.